I think we're good now. How are you feeling today?
I'm doing well, Tayshawn. How about yourself?
Wonderful, wonderful. I'm going to
Yeah.
give it a few seconds to see how many folks jump in.
Okay.
It looks like we got a good group of folks already. I think we can get this started now.
Good.
51 participants already. That's fantastic. So briefly, I'll introduce myself. My name is Tayshawn Glover. I'm a Newark resident, member, a Newark Museum of Art member, and publisher of the NewarkTimes.com. I'm very happy to be here. I'm very happy to be part of this conversation. More importantly, I'm happy to introduce and speak to Mr. Drew Lanham, author, alumni, and distinguished professor of wildlife ecology at Clemson University, and master teacher and certified wildlife biologist. That is a mouthful, sir. Thank you very much for being
here. Yeah, I'm really, Tayshawn, I'm just a bird brain. Really is all I am. So it's good to be here, and it's great to have this conversation with you tonight.
My pleasure, my pleasure. Let's start off with the baseline. From your mouth, could you speak to what it is exactly that John James Audubon did that was so profoundly significant in the field of ornithology and in art and in publishing? Like, what was the thing that made him such a big deal in the first place?
Well, John James Audubon was really kind of a triple threat of his time and when we're talking, let's say the highlight of his career, 1830s, okay? Mm-hmm. 1830s, 1840s. Mm-hmm. But what John James Audubon did for American ornithology was, and let's say Western science, was really to begin to lay down the ornithology of North America. Now, Alexander Wilson was also doing that, but John James Audubon did it with a certain swag and flair. So as he painted these birds artistically, he was presenting these birds in live poses. Mm. And so they appeared for many of the species to fly off the page or to perch on to perch in real life. So was doing that and a lot of people are surprised to learn that John James Audubon was killing these birds to do this. Mm-hmm. So he was on the American frontier, essentially hunting birds, mm-hmm. Posing them in these unique fashions and painting them. And then as he painted these birds, he was also having to self-market and to get his work out there. So he eventually had to go to Europe really to see any initial success. Mm-hmm. And as he goes to Europe, to Great Britain, to Scotland, he sells subscriptions and he becomes wildly popular. And part of this is that Audubon, has these long locks, these long black locks, and mm-hmm. he's dressing as a frontiersman. And mm-hmm. Say if cell phones had been available, he would have been tweeting all the time. He would have been, right. 7 or 8 selfies a day.
Right.
So, but Audubon was doing all these things, pushing ornithology, sort of romanticizing the American frontier, painting this artwork beautifully that people fell in love with, and telling these stories of wild America that made not just Americans imagine and think about birds, but everyone kind of do it. So, that's Audubon on sort of that artistic and scientific mm-hmm. side. On the other side, he was a slave owner. Right. He was someone who, didn't respect human life. He was denigrating indigenous people. So, mm-hmm. That's sort of John James Audubon in a nutshell, a true man of his time.
Yeah, it's been really interesting to me in doing the brief, study and research. I don't even know if I should be able to say study and research while having a conversation with you, but for the sake of tonight, I'll say the study and research that I did on exactly how impactful what his work was. It wasn't as, like you said, it wasn't as if animals weren't being portrayed and printed and illustrated. But what he did was create so much more context and so much more life in the imagery. A lot of the images of the birds previously, the birds were dead and they looked dead. He in his work brought life to them, not only in their poses and postures and expressions, but also in the habitat and the environment around them. They were part of an ecosystem in his illustrations. So it was incredibly eye-opening, not only to people within the field and people who were enthusiasts, but just in general, to have that deeper layer of a view into this wildlife, especially at that time where there was so much frontier to be explored, and there was so much unknown.
Yeah, I love the way you put that, to think about the context in which he painted, mm-hmm. right? And that's part of this discussion when we think about the context of the United States of North America at large, mm-hmm. at that time, and how much of it was frontier. And here is John James Audubon, in many ways, sort of blazing the trail, mm-hmm. And having people's imaginations opened in this different way. And when you read the notes that right. he wrote about these birds, Audubon got a lot right. Now, he got a lot wrong. Mm-hmm. He didn't have the modern tools of binoculars. He was birding by blast, as I say, mm-hmm. with a gun. And so as he collected these birds, he was dissecting them. He was presenting a lot of the anatomical measurements and the things that scientists and museums use and need. Mm-hmm. So you can glean quite a bit of science from what he wrote, but you can also gain some understanding, not just from his notes on the birds, but on his ornithological, his stories, essentially, mm-hmm. of culture of America. Right. And again, that's where Audubon sort of steps mm-hmm. beyond what the other ornithologists and naturalists, mm-hmm. others did, but not in the way that John James Audubon did it, Tashawn. Yeah. It was just this flair, and well, some of it, quite frankly, lies and exaggerations.
Right. Right. Yeah. He in his writing, he seemed to have brought theater to ornithology. I do want to ask you about, the subject, or the crux of tonight's conversation is really not exclusive or particular to John James Audubon. Over and over and over again, we as a society, we as a culture have had conversations around the complexity of honoring and acknowledging work that has pushed society forward by the hands and minds of people who were sinful, for lack of a better word, people who had their own personal particular flaws, errors, and how do we navigate? How do we remain truthful? What needs to be prioritized and when? This conversation is not a new conversation, and it's definitely not specific or exclusive to John James Audubon. But we do need to have this conversation in this particular case, because for one reason, in the case of someone like a John James Audubon, there have been many, many years of hoisting him up. Mm-hmm. And that hoist had to exclude a lot of this part of the conversation. So there is the narrative of who he was, and then there is the narrative of who he has been made to be in history. And we're having this furthering conversation of who he is being made to be in history.
Hey, Sean, again, well put. Here's the thing. You talk about that hoist. There's a privilege to sort of putting someone up on a podium, right?
Right.
But but Black folk, people of color,
Mhm.
folks who have been oppressed, are constantly having to pick their way through the mind
Mhm.
of truths that are out there. And so,
Yeah.
we sort of live these lives of having to wind our way through imperfection.
Mhm.
And not that any of us is perfect or have our own personal particulars that someone may not like, but when it comes to sort of these crimes against humanity,
Mhm.
as it were, that are visited upon an entire race of people, upon a diaspora for centuries, and you are complicit in it. And then when you have the opportunity to in some way either divorce yourself of it or even remedy one small portion,
Mhm.
and you double down,
Mhm.
then you're not only a minefield, but you're raining this sort of artillery of animus down on us. And so
Mhm.
I think, and trying to come to some resolution,
Right.
really not any sort of final answer, because as you said, it is complex. It's exceedingly complex. And so I had folks say, well, sure, you're going to burn your Audubon prints and any books you have. No, there's a yellow-breasted chat right over my shoulder, and my Birds of America is over the other shoulder.
Right.
I'm not burning anything.
Right.
I don't burn my dollar bills. George Washington and people on the money that we spend were complicit.
Right.
In so much of what we've seen happen and what we've experienced. But as you said, it's important to illuminate, to, as we learn, to understand who people were in the context of their time. So there's an opportunity to bring people forward who maybe were better, were ahead of their time, that show us what you don't have to be stuck in context.
Right.
You can exceed it. So I'm having these kinds of discussions.
I'm curious to hear, what were the conversations, or were there conversations among Black people in ornithology prior to this recent highlight of the controversy in the general public? Were there conversations, and what were they like just among Black people within the field?
Towards John James Audubon, not a whole lot, other than the whispers from time to time of, was this a brother passing?
Right.
That's one of the questions, right? That his Creole mother, was she holding Black blood? And we know that Creole is from the euphemism for a biracial person, a person with that one drop of Black blood that by Louisiana law would have made him Black. And when he shows up in the African American Museum in New Orleans, they know something, or that they're defining things in that way. So, there are whispers, as there often are among us. It's sort of like, tell people, it's just like, it was never any surprise to Black folk in South Carolina. Strom Thurmond had a biracial daughter.
Right.
The surprise was that 7 or 8 didn't pop up. So there are these whispers. Again, it's sort of the minefield that we have to pick our way through. And these truths that, or these rumors even, that other people may just sort of let slide by because there's the podium that this person has been put upon that raises them above scrutiny.
Right.
So, the conversations weren't so much about the past, but often about the present and how we deal with, one, a lack of diversity in our field, both as ornithologists, but also as bird watchers and nature lovers. How do we deal with that? How do we deal with the struggle and strife of doing what we do, and birding while Black, and meeting the resistance sometimes that both passively and outright aggressively. So those were the conversations, I think, more recently, at least when it comes to Audubon or John Muir or any of these sort of luminaries. it's not so hard for us the people that I know anyway, to sort of push back and say, oh, well, I didn't hold him up as a god anyway.
Right.
Because I sort of had reserved my divinity for others.
Right.
So that's kind of been the conversation, but more, I would say, sort of more whispers in the dark than sort of these outright conversations about who Audubon, who John James Audubon was, and quite frankly, who he is now, who he's becoming.
Yeah. What strikes me as especially interesting in this conversation is the inability to remove or divorce your culture from your life work. So for, bird watchers, for, folks in ornithology, particularly Black people, there is a contribution that you bring to the field that can't be brought in any other way. It is very peculiar and singular to what your culture is, and then by extension, what your worldview is. And how that is then butted up against the white supremacist views that John James Audubon held, and that have been historically deeply embedded into the culture of the country overall. Like this is coast to coast. Can you talk a little more about the resistance that you mentioned that you may experience, whether subtly or overtly, as a Black person in these fields?
Yeah, Tayshawn, it's
Sorry, I want to correct, a Black expert in these fields.
Oh, okay. Let me go back to sort of I'm going to go back to Netscape 2.0. It's a long time ago, because people couldn't just Google you and look you up, right?
Right.
They couldn't see you.
Right.
And so as a professional, I can remember getting calls to do bird talks. And I would agree to do these bird talks after getting this voicemail over tape, and I would show up and at one point in time had to tell people who I was to get into this white church, because here I was, this Black man knocking at the door. And I don't think they were expecting this particular visage.
Right.
And to have people sort of give you the second look, or be at a professional meeting and people know your work, but are talking to one of your grad students as if they are you, because they can that you are that ornithologist.
Right.
So, those are sort of the slights and just the those incidences of being invisible and overlooked. Also, those occasions when you are working in a space in the field, for example, and having that third eye that we all have open wider, because you feel threatened,
right?
Or you feel just uneasy about being where you are. And it's always interesting to me. I go back to my days as a graduate student and having to change my research project because of a white supremacist camp that was set up near my field site. And having to face peers and advisors with that news and saying, well, I'm really uncomfortable going there, but having that challenged. Well, why? Or even having it joked about. So, that's an issue of access. But it's also an expectation of acclimatization that will just fit in, that you will be like everybody else. And as good as your science may be,
right,
that you are expected to sort of just disappear into that crowd. So that's an expectation of disappearance. It's an expectation of just sort of sliding in and not really fully claiming who it is that you are. And I come to recent times, and Ahmed Arbery and thinking about him jogging through that neighborhood. And there are many of us that are fortunate in that we haven't been hunted down, but we felt eyes on us. We have been followed.
Right.
And so to be at the top of your game, right? But to feel like that you could be reduced to the bottom of it, have your life threatened or taken away because of the color of your skin, creates a different sort of angst that has you feeling like, well, wait a minute, did I really complete that work the way that I wanted to complete work? Or did I hurry through? Am I selecting where I do my work based upon who it is that I might encounter? Look, I've drawn out, I talk about range maps a lot, those things we find in field guides that define where a bird or some other critter may find comfort. And, if we remember the movie, the Green Book, we've been doing that for a long time. Knowing Black folk, knowing where you go, where you don't go, how you get there, what's the best way to get there to reduce threat. Well, that hasn't disappeared, right? So there's still places that I go in that third eye becomes hyperactive, where I'm thinking in sort of different ways. And I know that I have peers and friends, colleagues who experience that. And it's always interesting when I present my range maps talk to a group, the non-Black folks who sort of latch on to it typically are women and non-heterosexual others who say, you know what? Yeah, I did feel something different. Or my behavior is dictated by this fear that in some way you may have suppressed. And when you ask yourself, it's because, you know what, I understand that it's better for me not to be running out there at night or alone, or it's better for me not to have this bumper sticker or window sticker on my car, because I will be easily identified and a predator like a hawk can swoop down and take me out. So, from an expert standpoint and a professional standpoint, you feel like you've got to be at the top of your game at all times. You can't slip. You can't slip. But then also you can't slip while you're running and looking behind you. So it's sort of like spinning plates and juggling. And somebody throws a chainsaw in there, says, well, if you don't do that well too, then you're not worth it. So it creates this very different sort of, we talk a lot about imposter syndrome, but it's an odd kind of mix of things, Tayshawn, that's presented. And, for those folks who look like me, who do this work, either as a hobby or professionally, I know that they have into these issues, and you just can't. You have long memories, you remember it. It's adaptive. It's adaptive.
Yes. Yeah. It's so fascinating how, as you move through life, you generally move through your work, and the limitations and hindrances and blockages and attacks that, neurologically you've become, you have this pattern recognition. And even when you are in this space where you are for 1,000 feet in any direction, you're one of one. There is nobody else in this vicinity who is as studied as you are, who is as interested in what you're studying, the environment that you're in, what there is to be learned from it as you are. And yet you still have to juggle and manage those those feelings of attack, those feelings of uncertainty, those feelings of possible threat. I want to ask you about, the different ways that different organizations, particularly, or organizations that have the name Audubon in their name, the different ways that they are now acknowledging and addressing the controversy, and if and how they need to pivot and adjust to establish what their identity or what they want their identity to be in that context. Like, what are your feelings and thoughts in general on what's going on nowadays?
Wow. Well, I think about it in line with sort of our debate about monuments, right? Mm-hmm. And monuments aren't just things cast in granite. They're not just things that are cast in bronze. They are also they're also names. They're also really missions and visions of organizations. Mm-hmm. Those can be monuments. And so I think for me, there are certain monuments that need to come down, that they really serve little purpose other than to agitate.
Right.
So for example, I think about the Daughters of the Confederacy, and all of those Confederate clones statues that end up places where the Civil War, well, it was waged all over this country. I understand that, before states were even states, but then the amazing campaign, propaganda campaign that they were able to put forward. Mm-hmm. I think that that folks need to look at that and say, okay, so what do we represent? So just as you look at a monument, and before you look at it and say, well, this is the line in the sand, this can never come down. Well, why is it up in the first place? What is it representing? Now, you want to because I've never understood this whole American flag, Confederate flag on the same flagpole thing.
Right.
I've never understood that, because one is a flag of traitors and treasonists, right? And so I don't think you can serve those two gods,
right?
And patriotism. So to ask your question, and as many people as are flying the Stars and Stripes patriotically, but then would wave a Confederate flag beside it, that instantly tells me who you are. So those kinds of monuments, and again, that is a monument, that is the sin of commission right there, where just as you would keep someone enslaved, even as you had a chance to help them find liberty, when you wave that flag, right, you're telling me, okay, you can say, well, that's honoring my ancestors. Well, that's honoring your ancestors who did what?
Right.
So from the point of view of an organization, what do you stand for? And before I look at your name change, I want to see how your mission and vision is changing.
Right.
Whether or not you're willing not just to look at the outside and that appearance, because people will slap a bumper sticker on anything. It's lots of people who said Black Lives Matter because they want the pressure of people saying you did not say it.
Right.
So before you change your name, I need to understand that within that you are changing, that you're thinking really strategically, for example, about who is running the organization, and not just sort of this head and representative. A CEO is certainly important. Who's on the board? How are boards collected? And then what is the mission and the vision going forward in the new light that you claim? Because if you change your name and you're still operating the same, you're not different.
Right.
And I'll use the example. I'll go back to Audubon, because I've had people say, well, all of our data shows that John James Audubon did not have this black blood that people claim, blah, blah, blah. And I said, okay, cool. But, he still wrote a story about having the opportunity to liberate someone and re-enslaving them.
Right.
He still owned people.
Right.
So black or white, I have to see that sin as the same. I'm not qualifying that sin by whether he was black or white.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So in that way, I can't qualify your quality based upon your name.
Mm-hmm.
I need to understand, because that name change, quite honestly, yeah, you're going to lose some people.
Mm-hmm.
But you're going to find a way. These are very smart people who understand marketing. And if you're looking towards the future, if you're looking towards growing your organization, then you're going to look there. You're not going to look at this swagger, this 19th century swagger, as a way to keep promoting your
right.
So I think for me, that's what I'm looking at first. And so there are organizations who changed their names and made it known their intent to be different.
Mm-hmm.
But I also know organizations that haven't changed are earnestly working from the inside out to change the organization. So I see it sort of from two sides. There is the termite mentality to eat it down, and people not see it. And then there's the bulldozer mentality to push it down, to push the edifice down. And I think both can be effective, but I think I need to see that you mean what you say. And when I can begin to see that, right? When I can begin to see that, when I can begin to see not just the logo and the emblem change, but I began to see the intent change, that you're not just looking at the ranges of birds, but you're thinking about the ranges of the people that they share this land with.
Right.
Then I can get with those organizations. That has to be the first look. And I honestly, man, I think that, organizations owe it to themselves. And I've been a part of a couple of organizations, and they have taken a hard look around the board table, and they said, who are we?
Right.
And why do we look this way? Why don't we look differently? Should we be doing things differently? And it was tough on folks, not necessarily on me, but tough to reconsider changing the paradigm. So I take my hat off to those organizations who are willing to, from the inside, see themselves, take those hard looks in the mirror and say, okay, y'all, we got to rethink this. Let's think about what we've done well. Let's think about how we do it better. And biologically, ecologically, there are very few cases where people aren't arguing for diversity. Right. And so sociologically, though, people seem to have, an issue.
Yeah.
That. So that's my long answer. But Tayshawn, I got names. If people want names for organizations, if they want me to help them change, I got names for them. So, we that too.
Yeah, I think that for nothing else, to your earlier point, it does make the case that there are numerous other people who haven't received the acknowledgement for their contribution that they could have and should have. And if nothing else, this is an opportunity to do that. This is an opportunity to shine light where it's been closed off historically. We do have a couple of questions from the audience. Joyce asks, what sparked your interest in ornithology?
Joyce, it for me, thank you for the question. It was really flight, right? And flight for me means freedom and choice. And so to watch birds fly as a boy, to me, was the ultimate expression of flight. Sometimes escape, right? To think about a being who has the ability on a whim to flap its wings and ride the wind.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that to me is that inspired me. And I to be a bird, and gravity didn't work out. Not enough lift, not enough thrust, and too much my Aunt Wheezy's pound cake. And, you know, and so here I am grounded, but birds would always lift me. And so that's my inspiration, to watch them and to live vicariously through them, and understand as I studied them that they were traversing the world, right? That I could see a scarlet tanager and know that that bird had been in the Amazon, and that it had seen creatures that I wanted to see, that it was the world from this altitude that I could not attain without some assistance.
Yeah. Elsa Nazario made a comment. I think she meant to finish with a question, but the question got cut off. But she said she recently learned about Luis Agassi Fuertes, that he was half Hispanic.
Yeah.
And she said that it was surprising to her that this was known by his community, but not by the common person. Yeah,
I mean, let's think about but again, that's also a figure you begin to dig, right? Who had some issues. So, and we can find this throughout, but we look at sort of how people cover to fit, right? To be claimed, to gain acceptance. And again, I sort of go with that. Look, I'll be up front. I went back to Netscape 2.0 when people couldn't look me up. It's not like my whole life as an ornithologist that I have talked about these issues of race and place, right? Because one of my first efforts, I knew that I had to excel. I knew that I had to publish or perish. I knew to do these things. So I didn't talk a whole lot about it. As I was talking about prairie warblers and yellow-breasted chats and scrub habitats, I wasn't bringing forward the feelings that I had when I was in some of these places and I would see KKK painted afresh, right, sign that I had been by the day before. So it feels now in hindsight almost like I was hiding, right? Because I wanted my work to sort of speak for itself. But then, you know what? You get tired of that. You really, it's exhausting to try to live anonymously, so to speak. And I did not want to do that. And I felt, especially in my creative life as a writer, that as I moved into this realm of being able to speak from the first person, which we are not encouraged to do as scientists, that as I began to speak from the first person, that people needed to see me, because that's the ultimate. So Fuertes maybe felt, I don't know, as many people do, that the less they show of who they truly are, the more accepted they might be. But as you and I won't delve into that particular story now, but you also find sometimes that people turn upon themselves or their identity to gain acceptance. So it's the most horrific thing is to find out that there are those of us who look like us who have been against us, right? So when you find that out, you then begin to understand, Tayshawn, as you said, that complexity, that we really have to play with, and it becomes a minefield of sorts. So yeah, I encourage you to learn some more about Louis Agassiz Fuerte, and we can talk.
Yeah. Margaret asked I think this is like a two-part question. It says the National Audubon Society was established in 1905 and is one of the oldest organizations dedicated to the conservation of birds in the world. What would the impact of changing the name of NAS be for bird conservation? Is the name recognition that the Audubon Society confers in the ornithology community as the oldest organization focused on bird conservation important to the mission and might be lost if the name were changed?
Margaret, that's a great question. I will tell you, I know a little bit about that history. I should have gotten the book off my shelf because I have from the Charleston Museum a 1908 report from the South Carolina Audubon Society that's really concerned with the conservation of birds. 1908. And this was eventually presented, I think, in part to the legislature, but it lists, the decline of so many species. For example, it lists the decline of wildfowl, ducks. It lists the decline of birds like bobwhite quail. And one of the things that it is a very explicit in doing, and one of the ornithologists, Arthur T. Wayne of the time and others, and the names are listed here in this book. They list Black people as being among the major predators of birds in South Carolina and reasons for their decline. So along with that history, it's written down, right? And it's codified. It's codified. So here you have an organization on the one hand, and I remember one particular passage where a white hunter talks about not being able to shoot 1,000 wood ducks in a season, that he can only now shoot hundreds of wood ducks in a season, but that part of the reason is that Negroes are shooting birds, right? So they have birds to shoot. So I go to that point, but then I say, I think, Margaret, that part of what we might see, I look at the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, and I don't have the complete history on the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, but they've done a wonderful job in the old world in thinking about birds. Now, yeah, there is a great deal of colonialism wrapped up in that, in ornithology and science in general, and so we have to address that. But again, I think when we look at what there is to gain by being on the right side, not just of history, but of the future, that it's pretty easy to choose sides, right? It's pretty easy for people to wave flags of sunflower gold and sky blue now, right? Because it's clear what's going on. So I think when we look at a name that's been associated with the conservation of birds, but also the denigration of people, that if you want to involve people, you've got to show some direction towards change. And if you're going to keep that name, you need to explain why, right? You need to say, you know what, we're going to keep this name because look, here's the thing. A $20 bill with Harriet Tubman's face on it is going to spend the same as one with Andrew Jackson's name on it. So what would that change affect? Now, there are some people, I'm sure, who don't want to spend those $20 bills. But I use that to say, I think a name change, something as esoteric, and branding is important. I don't want to minimize that. But we've also seen organizations, we've seen products rebrand, seen them make a commitment, not to the past, but to the future. So if we make a commitment to the future organizationally, then again, you are also going to do a cost benefit. You're going to say, well, who are we going to lose? Who do we lose? Who do we gain? What do we gain? And that cost benefit that people do on Madison Avenue, other places every day, and people test run that. So I don't know, North American Society for the Appreciation of Wild Birds sounds like something that I would want to be a part of. Right. And I don't have to link somebody's name with it. I don't have to have birds named after people. but I think that when we come out full force, and all it's going to take is a few well-known names of people who really love birds, but also love humanity and want to be inclusive. Those people come out, then I think we begin to gain, because people ask, well, why don't we see more Black people, more people of color, more different people doing this? Well, because we haven't behaved differently. Mm-hmm. So I think that, if that decision is made, then if truly the goal is to protect birds, bird habitats, and people, and have birds and people living sustainably together, mm-hmm. and I think that we can, again, invest in the future instead of being embedded in that past.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Margaret, for that question, and thank you, Drew, for that answer. I just want to encourage folks, if you do have any questions that you want to ask, please feel free to add them to the Q&A section.
Hey, Sean, may I ask folks a question? What would you remain a part of an organization, understanding the history of it, if it had stood at one time or stood by as people were oppressed? You ask yourself the question, I think, do I want to be a part of that, or do mm-hmm. I have that as part of who it is that I am? And again, maybe it's not the name, mm-hmm. say, but there are certain names that it's really hard to get away from. Mm-hmm. I don't think that enough people understand maybe the complexity of Audubon to have that name sort of be a pariah yet. Mm-hmm. I always talk about micro social movement, and a large part of that is how we stand or stand by, mm-hmm. right? And what we stand for, and what we decide we're going to stand apart from. Mm-hmm. So those are questions that I ask that I think are important. And again, like I said, I haven't burned a single Audubon thing that I have. Right. It certainly changes my perspective in how I look at it, and I use it mm-hmm. to educate myself. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's interesting looking at Audubon's notes. Man, he loved crows, and back mm-hmm. then they were called common crows. They're American mm-hmm. crows now. Mm-hmm. But Audubon lauds these Black creatures for their intelligence, for their resourcefulness. Mm-hmm. Then he speaks of their persecution. Mm-hmm. And, I wanted to tweet at JJ and say, man, if you only felt that way about Black people, bro, right, that would have taken you to a different level. Right. But then I point out to people, there was a contemporary that John James Audubon had mm-hmm. that, wasn't perfect. But when you look at Henry David Thoreau and what Thoreau was doing at the same, mm-hmm. Roughly the same time, mm-hmm. that Henry David Thoreau was aiding and abetting abolition. Right. What's that? Right. Right. He was watching birds. Mm-hmm. He was furious. Mm-hmm. Henry David Thoreau was furious at the oncoming of the Fugitive Slave Act. And most people who love birds have read Walden, but mm-hmm. they haven't read Civil Disobedience. Mm-hmm. Here is a man who was a white man who was standing for nature, but also standing for human rights. Right. How much do we think about that? Yeah. It seems like a absurd phrase, but nonetheless, there has been the need for the humanization of human beings. Marilyn asked a question which speaks to what you just said. At the time, what did other artists think about his work? He was lauded, right? Mm-hmm. But the people who called Audubon out were some abolitionist societies for his story mm-hmm. way. Mm-hmm. which is to me the doubling down that Audubon made, because some said, well, in this story, The Runaway, if people aren't familiar with it, John James Audubon wrote these ornithological biographies, which were essentially stories of his travels. Right. And he tells of being in a bayou and meeting this runaway enslaved person, and talks about being fearful, and even indicates how he thought about maybe killing this person for his own safety. But this man treated him to a dinner, introduced him to his family, who he had also secured the liberty of. But then, over dinner and listening to owls and all this sort of stuff, Audubon makes the decision, you know what, you're better off being back where you were. So what if Audubon did make that story up? What if he didn't do it? Well, does that make him better?
Right.
Because he wrote it as nonfiction. He wrote this story as something for people to believe. So, the abolitionist societies called him on that. And so, but from an artist's standpoint, from what I know, I haven't done any extensive research on what others were thinking from an artistic standpoint. But again, he was avant-garde. He was putting something out there that that others could not see. And it's like so much art now, that we can see the genius, but then sometimes we don't see the corruption until much later. So, the art, I don't hesitate to say the artwork is genius. It's beyond beyond parallel and what we were seeing. But the way that I now look at that art, for example, I look at the portrait of long-billed curlew, and even though Audubon had collected most of the curlews in Texas that he painted, I think, he painted those curlews against this backdrop of Charleston, South Carolina. And when you think about what was going on in Charleston, South Carolina in the 1820s, 1830s, rice was making people more than filthy rich. People need to understand, in Carolina, cotton never was king. It was cotton. I mean, it was rice that was superlative. So I see those curlews, and I see the long, attenuated, decurved bills of those birds. But then I also know there were bills of sale in that city behind those birds, where people were being moved back and forth like livestock with less value than someone would have given to watching birds.
Right.
So, so the current way that we see art and the way that we are supposed to interpret art is not as the artist necessarily saw it, but also as we see it. So at that time, John James Audubon was a genius, and it was proven out by people. Look, at the time, people were being asked to shell out $3,000 for a subscription.
Right.
So think about how much money that is in current dollars. It's a lot. So in that way, it's obvious that you had a society, mostly, I think, that saw John James Audubon as beyond reproach, really.
There's the work that is done and its contribution to society is one thing, but as a society, our ideals, our priorities are expressed by way of our monuments. And so the monumentization of a person is the expression that this is the greatest good of us. These are the ideals. These are the best examples, which is why, here in Newark, the Christopher Columbus monument was taken down, as monuments have been taken down across the country. To your point, it's more so about what are you holding on to, and what are you not allowing yourself to gain by way of what the future will look like. Um, let me see if I can grab a couple more questions before we close out. Mike's asked, how do you, this first question is, how do you teach Audubon to young people?
Just as like this conversation, I bring it forward as a conversation. I try not to bring dogma to students. I have a saying, I can lead your brain to some knowledge, but I cannot make it think. I have no desire to have you think like I think, but I have the desire to have you think, to critically analyze. So part of the responsibility as a scientist is to present as much data as we have. And this is data. So we can look in the book, but don't just, and see what a lot of people do is they look at the plates and they look at the beautiful birds. They don't read the notes. But then if they read the notes, most people have not read ornithological biographies.
Right.
And so that's the way I try to teach students. So as I present how Audubon saw this bird, or what he saw the characteristics of the bird as ornithologically that he got right and that he got wrong. I also present what he saw and how he portrayed humanity and his context at the time. Then I sit back and I hope that they fill up the classroom chat box. Then I hope that they are asking questions. Then I hope that they're saying, we got to think about this in a different way.
Let's see if we can get one more in. So this says, if it's not too personal, how do you get your head around dealing with these issues beyond what you had initially learned about Audubon and his work?
It's, again, I feel fortunate in that I enjoy learning. And unfortunately, not all learning is sweet, right? And so, but it informs the way that I look at not only John James Audubon's art, but maybe the way that I look at other art, or the way that I look, as Tayshawn brought up, the way that I think about monuments and what we have as monuments. So, I think about what must it be like to be an indigenous person and look up and see these giant heads of oppressors looking out over your holy land. Right? It's not very different, I would imagine, than having to face, that Stone Mountain is no place to celebrate to me.
Right.
So how do I get my head around that? I get my head around that by saying, what, if we know better, we can do better. And how do we do better? We do better by informing others, who then hopefully don't go around blasting mountains away to carve monuments of oppressive people in them. So that's how I get my head around it, that we're going to think about doing better and that we're going to do better.
Right. Thank you so very much for your time tonight. This was a incredibly enjoyable experience, enjoyable to listen to you. If folks want to connect with you, how can they do that?
Tayshawn, first of all, thank you. And thank you to Newark, the museum, for hosting this. I'm greatly appreciative of it. I'm on Instagram and Twitter at Wild and in Color. You can find me on Facebook at J. Drew Lanham, and Gmail, Wild and in Color at gmail.com. That's where you can find me.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you, to the Newark Museum of Art for not only putting this conversation together, but also the endangered exhibit that's up currently at the Newark Museum. You can check it out. I want to apologize to the folks whose questions we couldn't get to, but thank you so very much for raising them. And I think with that, we're going to say good night.
Good night, all.